Hello, Houston. We're going to try and finish up our discussions of the development of sexuality today. And I've got a dazzling array of statistics that I want to share with you, some of which are simply unbelievable, as you will see. It turns out in several of these areas that we get it's very hard to actually nail down precise answers, but I'll give you some ballpark figures, and that's probably as close as we're going to be able to get in this particular area. So basically, if we look at what's going on in terms of patterns of sexuality, we're supposed to be, of course, active as adults within the context of marriage. That is, that's what's, this is what we were talking about last time. I knew that was the reason I had that on there. And so we had just finished each of these varieties of sexual expression. And now what I was going to do is go on and look at particular patterns of sexuality. So we're supposed to be active as adults, typically within the context of marriage. But actually what may happen is that marital partners may become involved with friends, with business associates, with someone else's spouse before adolescence, sometimes after reaching adulthood, and even in old age. So the first intercourse can occur in a wide variety of situations and circumstances without any doubt. So why don't we just look at it in terms of basically age, progressive increase in age. And if we look at sex and adolescence, there was one study, I still cite this even though I've used it in this course since tape 1, but in essence there was one well-to-do California community that was first studied about 15 to 20 years ago now, in which nearly 30% of the 11 to 13-year-olds were found to be sexually active. For middle school boys, their first intercourse on average had occurred at age 11. For girls, they were almost 12, really senior folks before they got into sexual intercourse. This may, of course, be an atypical community, and I guess some of us would hope that it actually is. But in that case, the typical U.S. male actually normally reports first intercourse around age 15 and a half, but you might want to question the data source there. We don't quite know what a 15 and a half-year-old is actually going to tell us about his sexual proclivities. And believing that kind of data, a typical U.S. female will report first intercourse at age 16. I'll show you some other data based on some 65,000 people who were surveyed across 4 kind of representative communities around the country here a little bit later. But essentially by age 19, we might argue that as much as 70% of the girls and even 80% of the boys have been sexually active. The net result of that, surprise, surprise, is that half of all babies have mothers that are under 18. And the net result of that is that results from over 1 million teenage pregnancies annually in this country, yielding about 400,000 abortions on an annual basis among women who are under 18 in age. Let me, in fact, share some other data with you to give you a kind of an understanding of what's going on here during adolescence. If we ask essentially, and this was done in a survey that involved some 65,000 youngsters, and they were surveyed basically largely in the 90s, from 1991 through 1997. When they surveyed or summarized across the approximately 65,000 adolescents in the 4 nationally representative samples that were drawn, the age at first sex was reported to be 12 or earlier by 5% of the people who were studied here. Recognize now that what I'm citing here is cumulative percentage, because you'll see why I make that point in a minute. But by age 13, approximately 10% of all youngsters have engaged in intercourse. By age 14, the number climbs to 17%. By age 15, it's up to 28%. By age 16, it's up to 43%. And by age 17, about 59% of all youth have participated in sexual intercourse in some form. I stress again that that's a cumulative figure, because if you add up all the percentages, it comes to over 100%. So again, the point is simply that's of the 17-year-olds, 59% have engaged in sexual intercourse by that age or younger in the course of maturing. There were a couple of other things that were pulled out of these studies that were also kind of interesting, and that is that if you compare early initiators, that is youngsters who participated in sex at age 13 or younger, and contrast that with adolescents who were later initiators, that is age 16 or older, some rather interesting changes occur. And and that is that in comparing the younger to the older, the younger were less likely to use condoms at their last intercourse, and the difference there is 50% reported having used a condom, whereas among those 16 or older upon first intercourse, 60% of them reported having used a condom at their last intercourse. And in addition, the younger are more likely to have multiple sexual partners in the last 3 months. 47% of people whose sex activity had started at age 13 or younger reported having had multiple sex couplings in the last 3 months, contrasted with amazing 11% of those who were 16 or older upon first engaging in sex. So the age of initiation does have some remarkably predictable effects on the likelihood of engaging in intercourse. One of the things that's been heartening to watch in this data is that while there has been a progressive move toward earlier and earlier age for first intercourse, the evidence suggests that since the late 90s and into the 2000s, the data does seem to be stabilizing, and that first intercourse appears to have essentially the age at which it is engaged in appears to have stabilized in more recent times. That's the highest rate in the U.S. among Western countries, but it doesn't mean necessarily that our teens are the most sexually active. It might reflect, among other things, refusal to provide birth control, which is typical in this country, or refusal to provide meaningful sex education, which is also typical in this country. Parents refuse to support sex education in schools, and yet high school teachers, if you ask adolescents, high school teachers are the single most widely respected authority for teenagers, particularly regarding advice regarding sex itself. That group, however, also is in need of some considerable advice because there are a number of what are called erroneous beliefs that are harbored by teenagers, probably generated out of that teenage invincibility that we were talking about before, the idea that we carry around when we're 13, 15, 16, that nothing bad can happen to us. And they will have a number of other ideas about first intercourse. For instance, the idea that no pregnancy can happen the first time you have intercourse. That's a widely held misbelief. No intercourse without an orgasm, optimistic but not true. And no orgasm, I'll get it right eventually, no pregnancy without ejaculation. It turns out, as I hope you will realize, that all three of those are simply wrong. But if you harbor one or more of all three of those beliefs as an error in your own structure, you may potentially get yourself into trouble that you had not even anticipated, because it turns out none of those beliefs is actually correct. So then we can look at sex among people in the college age group, and some rather interesting things there happen. One of which is that there's rather conflicted evidence regarding the prevalence of sexual relations on today's college campuses, partly because of an awkwardness in collecting that kind of data initially. But there are some other things that tend to be going on college campuses that would be indicative of some of the conclusions that I'm going to reach here. One of which is that dorm visitation rights seem to be nationally being curtailed somewhat. They're being cut back. I can remember when I was still an undergraduate at the University of Rochester in 1962 is when I graduated, and the following fall, fall class of 63, 64 was the first time they actually integrated the dorms. I can remember there used to be one dorm, an X-shaped dorm on the far side of campus. Well, at least from my perspective, it was on the far side of campus. All of the women at that time were housed in that dorm, and their integration involved having one quarter of the dorm had one floor in which men were allowed to be housed. So the integration occurred very, very gradually. My son is an undergraduate there now, and in general, there are dorms, essentially laminated, male, female, all the way across. There are some other dorms with parental permission where the integration is by room. There'll be a male room next to a female room, next to a male room, and so forth. So the integration has taken all sorts of different forms. Parents who often are paying the bills still are consulted in terms of where your child will be allowed to live in that kind of a situation. But there does seem to be nationally a little bit of a cutback in the flexibility of rooming arrangements that have been permitted over the years. It may also be that with the arrival of serious forms of birth control, that sexual relations are now being viewed as a short-term relation quite differently than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's very unlikely, I would argue, that there's been a decline in the frequency of engaging in sexual intercourse, but the conditions under which it occurs, the environment may be changing substantially. The old double standard probably still exists, maybe in the form of a new, what we might call double standard, because both sexes wish to maintain their own sexual freedom, and yet at the same time they're very much in favor of severely limiting the sexual activities of the partner that they're ultimately going to marry. So that's a kind of a reverse double standard that's going on there. It's okay for me to mess around, it's not okay for you to mess around in terms of a marital partner, and that's the same view held on both sides. Another change that's going on is that there is significant evidence that young women may be taking charge in initiating sexual relations these days, partly because of the much wider availability and use of birth control measures. There are a variety of signs of approachability that females will exhibit in a budding sexual relationship. I can't even model all these, but a carefree flip of the hair is a come-on signal. Fleeting glances will also occur. Leaning into someone, brushing them with a breast. I mean, that's frontal aggression of the most interesting kind. The 3-second fixed stare. Skirt hiking, primping, head tossing, solitary dancing, which will go on in mixed dance situations. Sometimes a woman will be out on the floor dancing alone, but keeping very precise time with the music. So there are a lot of different cues that women can exhibit for approachability, or the desire to be approached, I should say. It's interesting that males kind of go the other extreme. They tend to read women's behaviors through sexually tinted glasses all the time. And they're more likely, for instance, when given a neutral tape, to interpret that tape in sexual terms than are women. So the same tape viewed by men versus women are interpreted much more neutrally by the women in that situation. We can also then look at things like sex during marriage. Newlyweds, frequency of sexual intercourse declines with novelty. Very active during the weeks, months immediately following getting married. But in fact, the average wedded couple may engage in sex 2 to 3 times a week in the weeks immediately following getting married, but it slips to typically less than one time a week after about age 50. And again, I'm talking vast averages here. The causes of decline are many. Biological aging is one, but there are a number of others that could also be involved. Things like boredom. One of the problems of monogamous relationship that we so steadfastly maintain. Fatigue. He may be the one that says, "Oh, not tonight, dear. I'm too tired." There may be career demands because there are only 168 hours in the week, and if the boss is pushing you for output, sleep time is one of the things that gets cut into. The detrimental effects of recreational drugs, not so much marijuana as alcohol, clearly have a role in declining ability in sex. And as drinking goes up with age, declining ability in sex may be one of the consequences of that. There are also factors attributable to disease or the old fear. You have nothing to fear but fear itself. But all of this may lead to a search for various ways for increasing sexual interest for anybody in a marital situation. And the question regarding have an affair is interesting. I'll show you this data in a couple of different ways, but back in the 1970s, it was often reported that, in one study at least, that 40% of the women, of the men, and 35+% of the women would acknowledge having had an extramarital affair. In the early 80s, that had climbed to 49, almost 50% of the men would acknowledge so, and about 45% of the women would acknowledge that kind of a extramarital affair. But that's data that is very hard to come by, because you've got the guilt that is involved and the suppression of truth that may engender in people. So it's likely that any of these figures that I cite regarding an affair are probably underestimates of what's actually happening in a given situation. But there are also other things that go on. Spouse swapping may occur within a two-couple situation. There may be group sex if a bigger party gets started and everybody gets involved. There are even swingers who will swap spouses in a group or couple to couple formally as part of their social arrangements in a given neighborhood. So it's as widely varied as we humans are, essentially, in terms of the likelihood that an affair will result. So then one of the questions we can ask is, well, okay, what are the factors that actually influence the expression of sexuality? And there are several different, I can name about half a dozen here that we'll review at least briefly here. Fantasy may be actually the single most effective stimulus for sexual arousal. Written material is better for some people because it becomes a better stimulus for the imagination. Photos don't give you much to work with. It's just that person in that state. But writing allows you to fit it into your own head and wrap it around your own particular desires. And so in that way, written material in some ways is a more effective stimulus for sexual arousal. The greater the variety of people's sexual fantasies, the more sexually experienced they tend to be. The lower they are in guilt, I had trouble reading my print here, the lower they are in guilt about sexual arousal and sexual fantasies, the more they tend to be sensation seekers. So if you see a skydiver, you've probably got somebody who is absolutely guilt-free about any kind of sexual involvement. Women fantasize less often, and they favor more romantic themes in the fantasies that they do generate. Men tend to include more actual personal experiences in their fantasy life. Higher fantasizers among women tend to be the more highly orgasmic also. So there are a lot of different ways in which fantasizing correlates with various kinds of sexual experiences. Recreational drugs are another general category that we could look at, and in terms of marijuana, that's a relatively neutral impact on it may impact joy level, but it doesn't have specifically too much demonstrated effect on the sex drive and sexual expression itself. Alcohol, on the other hand, does have demonstrable effects. High levels of alcohol input tend to decrease sexual arousal. What it does is to or what I should say is the effects of low to moderate consumption of alcohol are less clear to demonstrate. Disinhibition supposedly heightens sexual arousal and thus may increase the likelihood of sexual advances in a party situation. Under condition where sexual urges are high and the costs of responding are also high, alcohol increases sexual responsiveness. I'm thinking there, for instance, of a party of potential employers. If you're in a situation where at a job fair a number of potential employers are throwing a party that has alcohol involved in it, as the cost goes up, the responsiveness generated by alcohol also tends to go up in that kind of situation. Women are more disinhibited than men by alcohol. But the effects are not simple. One possibility is, for instance, that a teenager who drinks actually delays the arrival of full sexual maturity as a growing adult. But alcohol is clearly, among the recreational drugs, perhaps the one that is most impactful in terms of what's normally going to occur. Another factor that clearly has jumped in and begun to impact sexual arousability and responsiveness is birth control. One of the difficulties, of course, here is that birth control devices may actually inhibit spontaneity during sex. And there is, of course, the always present pregnancy dilemma. If you don't use it, the problem is that pregnancy is possible. Definitely, yes. On the other hand, if you use it, too much sex may be an indicator that you're not a good person. There's no evidence of that. That is the idea that people will self-analyze and say that, gee, I carry a condom with me, or I have a condom, I'm not a good person. There's no evidence of that supporting, so that one we can strike down. It is not associated with promiscuity. That is the tendency to keep a birth control device with you is not associated with one being promiscuous in a given situation. What really is probably the best way to fold birth control into the factors that influence sexual expression is to say that what you do is to retain spontaneity, through informed choice of contraceptives and knowledge of how to use the various devices that are involved. Another factor that can obviously impact responsiveness to sexual stimulation is aging. In men, achieving and maintaining an erection gets harder with age, pun intended. They may require, among other things, more time involved in foreplay, more actual sexual stimulation. In women, the vagina expands, or expansion and lubrication tend to decline with age, particularly impacted by menopause. Sexual interest and activity do not necessarily decline with age. And in fact, the best predictors of that are things like the earliness of sexual activity, and secondly, the frequency of sexual activity through the adult years. That's perhaps the best single predictor of the likelihood of continued sexual activity in older age. Females, of course, have the issue of menopause, the ceasing of menstruation that occurs during the late 40s, early 50s. An accompanying effect there is the fact that hormonal levels also decline on menopause. And it sounds like I may have quoted this to you before, but I'll give it to you again because it's enlightening data. Bernice Newgarden did a survey, did several studies during her career of older humans, male and female, regarding their opinions of women particularly, for instance, their view of the effect of menopause on their sex life. And what they said was that basically 50% of them thought that menopause made them look worse, that they looked worse after menopause. I would argue that may be nothing more than an aging effect that we carry around as a society. We have kind of the idea that the older you get, the uglier you get, and that's the aging effect. And that may be the reason why fully 50% of women think that menopause, as simply one of the events during aging, leads to they're looking physically worse. 43% reported that it had no effect on them. 1% said they thought they looked better following menopause than before it, and 6% had various responses like, it's none of your business. Is sex more important to women by self-report after menopause? 18% said yes, 65% said it made no difference, and 70% said no, it's less important. That is as close to a non-significant difference as you can find in that kind of a survey. Another factor that can also impact your sexual activity is the ego. Ego games tend to underlie the performance pressure that some sexually active people tend to feel. And there's some very interesting ways in which that may be reflected by the man and or the woman. Think about the fact that if you turn to somebody and say, was I the best you've had? A variation of that, or how good was I? You're really going at it in the wrong way. Consider just that last question. How good was I? Really says as much about you as anything else, more so than if you were to ask the same question by saying, how good was it? Because in that case, you're really implying that it is, as it is, a mutual act. And you may, by respecting your partner, rather than being totally egocentric in this, the overall enjoyment of sexual activity may be greater, and the information you gain about your own self may be greater. Some people are so ego-dominated that they actually are disappointed if their partner doesn't have an orgasm, which may in fact be as much a comment on their skills as a performer as anything else. But egomaniacs may have more difficulty achieving sexual response in a positive, self-fulfilling way. The solution basically is to concentrate on the needs and the humanity of your partner rather than on pumping your own ego. Pun intended. It's such a rich area. I read a very interesting article one time written by a sexologist, an MD who specialized in sex. And what he indicated, he was a golfer, as it turns out. And he was writing in a medical journal a most interesting, a thought-provoking article that I never really thought about before. But what he said was that as a golfer, he had been all over the world playing golf in this club, that club, the other club. And in any of those golf clubs, he could go into the 19th hole, the bar in the clubhouse, after a round of golf, and engage in a conversation about how do you play hole 16, what are the difficulties with number 14, which club to use, anything about golf anywhere in the world at any club in the world. But in that same far-reaching conversation as a sexologist in clubs all over the country, he had not once had a conversation related to sex and sex performance. And yet, probably, if you total up all the time that he spent as much time involved in sex activities as he did in golf, and yet it was just never something, we just don't talk about it. As big a role as it plays in our lives, it's just a no-no. We don't talk about it. We certainly don't compare techniques with one another, which is strange when you stack it up against what goes on in any sport, for instance, golf. So, let's also look at another area that we really should spend a little bit of time on, and I'm really spending much more time on the whole topic than I meant to, but sexually transmitted diseases called STDs are another example, and there is a horrendous array of these that we can review. One of them is gonorrhea. It's caused by bacteria in the urinary tracts of men and women, and the result is a yellowish discharge in men, a burning while urinating in both sexes. Those are our key cues to the idea that gonorrhea may be the problem. It's the oldest, by far, not by far, but the most prevalent sexually transmitted disease that exists, and it can remain contagious for a couple of hours on a toilet seat. And it can, if you contract gonorrhea, it can cause sterility. It is treatable by penicillin, but it is a vicious sex-related illness. A second one is syphilis, which is detected by cankers, which are ulcer-like sores on the genitals or other body parts, usually in that general area, in both men and women. There is a secondary stage in becoming more seriously infected where there are rashes, there may be sore throats, headaches, weight or hair loss, and in the tertiary stage there may be attacks of the nervous system causing things like paralysis, insanity, blindness, and ultimately, if untreated, even death. It may have been brought to America originally. Interestingly enough, there's some thought it was brought to America by Columbus's crew. And it is treated best in the first and second stages. The initial one I described with the ulcer-like sores on the genitals and other body parts. But on the first and second stages, it's treated by penicillin. The same was also true for gonorrhea. That is also responsive to penicillin. A third one has to do with chlamydia, which is an inflammation of the urinogenital tract. It leads to watery discharges in men. It leads to burning, itchy genitals in women, and this can be treated by antibiotics. Another one is genital warts. That's an easy one to fix. You simply burn them off, and there's no direct problem as a result of that. Related to that, however, is a complex illness, and that's what's called genital herpes, which is actually produced by the herpes simplex virus, often called HSV. One person had a comic line about what's the difference between true love and herpes. Herpes is forever. It is. If we define genital herpes, it's caused by a virus related to one that causes cold sores. It can be characterized by recurring blisters on the penis and urinary tract of men and on the labia, cervix, and anus of women. In fact, the organs in that area for both men and women. Two different general types of therapy are available for this. A short-term solution is not available, but there are several different drugs that are reasonably good. One way is to treat it episodically. That is, when the herpes begins to show up, treat it with one of three types of drugs. One is called valacyclovir. I have trouble with these. Valacyclovir is one, Valaciclovir. That you would take 2 times a day. There is a second one called acyclovir, which would be available or would be taken 5 times a day. And there's one in the middle called famciclovir, which you take 3 times a day. If you do that only when the illness shows up, then you're treating it episodically. There are other treatment programs that involve some of these same drugs that may be used as suppressive therapy. That is, by keeping those chemicals in the bloodstream, what you're doing is essentially trying to reduce the occurrence of the cankers and the sores at all. And that is yet another form in which genital herpes can be treated. And then we get to the gorilla in the room, and that is AIDS. I want to spend a little time talking about that because of its general importance in our society. And AIDS, of course, identifies acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And if you look at the label, you can understand essentially much about the condition itself. The word acquired means that you can get infected by it. Not by AIDS itself, but by the HIV virus, which I'll get to in a minute. But it is, in fact, an infectious disease. The idea of calling it immune deficiency is the idea that what happens is that a weakness in your body's system is created. The system that normally fights to suppress and eliminate disease is basically hindered by AIDS. It's gradually weakened. And the net result is you're going to lose your ability to fight illnesses. And third, calling it a syndrome is essentially to identify a syndrome is essentially a group of health problems that make up a given disease. AIDS is caused by a virus called the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. You get HIV when you obtain HIV or HIV infects you. The body will fight the infection by making antibodies, which are special molecules to battle the HIV. It is important to realize that the virus will multiply in your body for several weeks, even several months, before your immune system begins to respond. And that creates an initial period following infection that can be quite dangerous, because during that time you will test HIV negative, but you can infect your sex partner. Blood tests that have been developed for AIDS are seeking to detect the HIV, and it's possible to still be testing HIV negative even though you've contracted HIV, as I said, and I want to stress that, and you can therefore already infect someone. But if you find the virus in a test for HIV, you have the HIV infection, and you are considered then to be HIV positive. If positive, for having the HIV disease, that does not mean that you have AIDS. That's a separate state. You may be in that state of being HIV positive for many years. This will gradually, as I said, wear down. The HIV will gradually wear down your immune system, and the net result is essentially devastating. You become susceptible to viruses, to parasites, to fungi, to bacteria, all of which normally are no threat to the body at all. That is, the immune system can develop antibodies and destroy them without any problem. But what you become susceptible to is what are referred to as opportunistic infections, or OIs, as they are sometimes labeled. You don't catch AIDS, okay? You can be many years between infection of HIV and developing of symptoms of AIDS itself. Most people get the HIV virus in a variety of ways. One of the older forms, although that doesn't tend to happen as much anymore, is sharing a needle to inject drugs with someone who is carrying the HIV virus. That is a strict no-no. Having sex with someone who is infected by it and may not even be aware of it, as I'll show you here in a few minutes. Or by being born to a woman who is infected, who herself is infected, or drinking breast milk from an infected woman. That can also lead to the HIV virus within you. It used to be the case that transfused drugs were a major source of the HIV virus. Now that medical folks are sensitive to that, the drugs, the blood, the donated blood is tested very thoroughly, and that is rarely a problem now. It is possible, but it's very rare for that kind of a transmission to occur. There's no evidence, for instance, listing things like tears or saliva as being the vehicle of transmission. But oral sex or deep kissing can convey HIV through things like open mouth sores or bleeding gums. Both of them can lead HIV, can give HIV admission to your body. Statistics regarding the occurrence of HIV, oh, I didn't realize that I had all those for you. But if we look at the statistics, the first time I did this program, 15 years ago or so, the estimate of deaths was in 1984, about 3,000. 1985, it was about 5,000. And there really, in just those 2 years, there was a hint of what was coming, because the number of deaths almost doubled in 1 year. That's a hint that there's a major illness coming into our society, as it was at that time. Now, the Center for Disease Control estimates somewhere between 1 and 1.2 million U.S. residents have HIV infection. They are AIDS prone, even though they may not yet be involved with it. Among that group of 1 to 1.2 million people, 25% do not even know they have it, statistically. 75% of the 40,000 annual new infections are men, 25% are women. In the mid-1990s, AIDS was a leading cause of death. But the data now suggests that there have been, I'll get back to it in a minute, but drugs have been developed, that are a significant help in stalling AIDS. But this will just give you the most recent data that's available from the government at this point. It's several years old, but it gives you an idea of the magnitude of what we're dealing with here. And that is the estimated number of AIDS cases newly arriving as a function of age is on the left column. The age obviously is in the furthest left column. And on the right, what you're seeing is the cumulated estimated number of AIDS cases up through 2007. So that's a cumulative listing of the number of people infected up to and including 2007. And as you can see, it very much follows our likelihood of sexual activity, and that is that the mid-adult years are where some of the most significant number of cases show up. And again, recognize in this data, there's a latency factor, because the HIV actual infection may have occurred months, years earlier than what this data actually demonstrates here. How do we fight it? There are a number of different drugs that have been developed to slow down the HIV virus by slowing the damage that it does to your immune system. There's basically no way to remove HIV from your system once infected. There is no cure for AIDS. The opportunistic infections that we were talking about earlier can be slowed by these newer drugs. One of the general class of drugs that's involved are called antiretroviral medications, so-called ARVs, and they're very effective in reducing the rate of most opportunistic infections. Though some of those OIs remain very difficult to treat. Overall, perhaps the most applicable general description of the cumulative effects of HIV and AIDS is variable. That's the best way to label it. There is such wide variability in the length of time of the initial infection, the length of delay caused by ARVs, the severity of symptoms experienced by the infected. The key event, as I said, is simply variability. You can't, for any given case, predict what the ultimate outcome is going to be. The treatment effects are highly individualized. Sleeping around is not good emotionally or practically in this day. The challenge is basically to prevent our society from basically slipping back into the dark ages of Victorian prohibitionism. But I found a quote, it's about 10, 15 years old now, but it really kind of summarizes the best strategy to adapt. And that is to say that relative to AIDS, to carry barrier methods of contraceptives in the hope of finding a sexual partner was once a matter of delicacy. But now it must be seen as the only option, quoting from Dingle and Oy back in 1997. That's a very telling, responsible kind of comment relative to how to deal with the possibility of AIDS. So that's sex from A to Z, alpha to zeta, whatever. Let's switch now and start looking at what we do with all this. It's kind of funny to be talking about sex at one part and then careers in the next. I'm not advocating you go from careers into sex, but there are careers in that arena as in many others. But let's kind of have a look at what the world of work offers for us here. A number of years ago, I was teasing the department administrator about the fact that she was leaving one afternoon at precisely 5 o'clock. And her retort was instructive. What she said to me was, some people have jobs, others have positions. I have a job. And in essence, what she was saying there is that in the world of work, there are really two major ways in which we can separate out different ways in which we can be gainfully employed. And the distinction that she was good-naturedly making is at the heart of what Whiten and his co-authors are distinguishing, and that is between a job, which is essentially a task or an undertaking or an activity that is performed for pay. And such an activity is of little psychological importance to the worker who holds the job, although it does provide pay to provide for the comforts of life. I mean, you earn a living and you can benefit from that life. But the job is the kind of thing you hang up at the door. You don't have to take it home with you. You don't fuss about it. On the other hand, what I'll be spending most of the time here with is discussing careers, and that's quite a different animal. In that case, what we're talking about is a sequence of positions occupied during the course of a lifetime of work in which there is some identifiable continuity in the progression of positions held. That's a career, okay? It implies that work is a central aspect of that person's life. A lot of different examples that I could cite here. I can use my own case as one particular example. Generally in my career, when I graduated from UT Knoxville, that's the original UT, I would point out, by 100 years. I taught at the University of South Carolina for 6 years as an assistant professor. I took a leave of absence at the American Psychological Association in Washington. And then after being at APA in Washington, it was kind of not exciting to think about going back to Columbia, South Carolina. So we started looking around for a job and found one here at the University of Houston, where I was hired as an associate professor. 4, 5, 6 years after that, I was then promoted to full professor, during which I got leaves at the University of Missouri, Stanford University, and the overall effect is that that would be a typical description of a career. One benefit of a career is the fact that I got to work at 7:30 yesterday morning, having to compose about half of the lecture that I'm delivering now. It was not yet done. And that's one of those things where it has to be done. When the camera goes on, it's kind of dumb to sit here looking at me scratching myself with nothing to say. You got to be able to talk when the camera goes on. The net result was that I didn't leave for home until 10:30. Last night, which resulted in a 15-hour day. That's the kind of thing a career can get for you sometimes. But I'm not paid by the hour, and it's really the need to deliver that material that kept me there as long as was necessary. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the wife of John F. Kennedy, assassinated president, and later of Aristotle Onassis, was rich beyond belief. She really did not have to work. And yet through her entire life, she held a job as a book editor at Doubleday Books for years following the deaths of both of her husbands. Aside from sleep, you're probably going to spend more time on work-related activities than any other activity. And for many of us, it will be simply the most time-consuming activity that we are engaged in during life, including sleep. There are a number of different ways to split out what we do in careers or in job-related activities. And one of the more interesting ones is to look at paid versus unpaid work, because all of us may be hooked into or involved in either of those. When you look at students and talk to them, sometimes you hear a phrase like, "I'm just a freshman," which always annoys me. You're not just a freshman, you are a freshman, okay? It's not a diminutive state at all. It's one that we have all moved through. The first 30 hours at the University of Houston, you're a freshman. It's a stage of life, but we move through it. Everybody's got to start somewhere. With women, you talk to them and you will sometimes hear a woman say something like, "I'm just a housewife." Again, it's apologetic. It involves an implied apology, as if the work, some of the paid work, is really the only worthwhile version of work. And yet all of volunteerism is not paid, and yet it's vital. Agencies like the American Red Cross could not operate without volunteer labor. So to be paid or not to be paid is not relevant to whether you have a career. Okay? It includes, housewife's job includes things like housework, yes, childcare, yes, but there may also be related work that can go on both within the family and, for instance, entertaining when the boss comes to visit. That is now becoming increasingly, well, I'm jumping ahead there, I'll get to that in a minute. Why does this implied difference exist between the relative supposed devaluing of housewife and valuing of house husband or wage earner, whichever? We have different type of socialization that used to be true, and this is increasingly kind of fading into our past, luckily. But for many years, certainly as I came up through elementary, middle, and senior high school, girls were trained largely for housework, and boys were trained for extra housework, outside of housework. That is essentially a job other than in the house. In a perversion of that logic, of course, some men simply assume that doing too much housework weakens their position as head of household. Not true, but some would maintain that position. Actually, an effective way to demonstrate leadership is to be able to perform each of the roles of those who are being led. Theoretically, if leadership is actually involved in that situation. It is interesting that there is a television program that was recently introduced during the year that we're taping these lectures. I think it's called Boss, if I remember correctly. And what they've done in that show is to take the chief operating, the head executive of various industries, and they've allowed him to apply for a job. It's only been a him so far, interestingly, but allowed the overall chief executive officer of the industry to apply for a job within one of the operating facilities that he governs. And they've done a variety of different industries that are national in scope, and therefore they have offices all over the place. And it's been amazing to watch the way in which the ultimate boss is ultimately greeted by people once they actually understand who they're dealing with. But what you're seeing there is what those super bosses are really demonstrating is that they can step in. And I know of only one instance so far where one of the chief executive officers was fired by one of his employees. That led to a kind of an interesting exchange afterwards, but he wasn't able to do one of the jobs that company was responsible for. In a power analysis, in households where women don't work outside the home, they contribute less money to the operations of the house. That may also be true of those where the woman is a second career, and that is increasingly coming. For some women, doing housework establishes an arena of control in things like whether or not the shirts get washed, which shirts get ironed, what you're going to serve for supper, and so forth and so on. So there is control and an exchange of control that's going on, even in the most balanced one-career family. But changes are coming, and there are a lot of modern changes that you will be familiar with already. Modern changes that I could easily cite would be things like the effects of World War II. You, of course, weren't there, most of you, during World War II, but it has had a very profound impact on our society. And that is that what it did for the first time in modern times was create opportunities for women to enter the workforce in vital numbers and in large numbers, because all the soldier age people, 18 to 24 or 25, were across the seas, even in either Europe or the islands surrounding Japan, fighting the Second World War. The end of the war, of course, resulted in many of the military returning home for the first time, and some interpreted that as a reversion to the older format. A man works outside, woman works inside the home. It's not so, if you examine the data. For the last century, at least, the number of women in the workplace has been going steadily upward. And by 1970, it is, some estimate, was the first time in history when more than half of the women reached age 25 to 64 were actually employed. That is through the normal adult working years. More than half of the women, 25 to 64, were actually working outside the home. A second factor here, and again, I should qualify that statistic. Depending on who you read, I've seen that year cited as anything from 1970 up to as late as 1995. So it really depends on which data source you use. That's a hard figure to really nail down. But it is clear more and more women are working outside the home, have a career of their own. And in fact, dual career families will become the norm when we discuss retirement in another 30, 40 years. Not you and I, but whoever's lecturing in this position at that time. Another factor is baby boomers. And that is after World War II, there was a significant boost in the number of kids, and it caused impact in higher education and so forth. A lot of changes were precipitated by the baby boomers. But in essence, those baby boomers, as created and as maturing, entered a workplace with a wide variety of jobs essentially for everybody. The economy was booming and growing through that era largely. Today's college graduate may face a different kind of scenario because at the moment we're in what turns out to be a lengthy recession, and that has resulted in a slight decline in the total number of jobs. It's a little hard to read. I had one source that was suggesting that one college graduate in 9 wouldn't find a college-level job when entering the marketplace upon graduation. I don't necessarily want to hang my hat on that because, again, it depends on the data source you're reading. But there is some increasing difficulty ahead in finding jobs. Does that mean actually that you should quit now and join the wonderful world of work and start your career immediately? Not at all. Let's look at it in a couple of different ways. What are the trends? It is clear that temporary employment is increasing. And I was looking for the data. I could not find one that I could copy off the internet to show you, but I did stumble across one rather interesting statistic, and that is that if you look at the number of people who are employed part-time, that is going steadily upward. It's a national trend over the last probably decade at least. We're right at a peak right now simply because the number of full-time workers that have been released in an economic measure is now identified by companies as needing to be reemployed. They have to have people doing some of the jobs that people used to do full-time, now being hired by part-timers. What is happening, the curve, the difference that I wanted to report to you was the fact that if you look at the number of people employed part-time, citing it, for instance, by wage, it is continuing. No, wait a minute, what was the point I was trying to make here? I know the curve I'm describing. Basically, what's happened is that the number of people employed full-time, part-time, temporary employees has dropped slightly in the most recent quarter. But yet the productivity per worker has gone up. And productivity is the wrong word to use. The absolute dollar production of the workers has continued to go up. And what that means is that one of the things that the workplace is beginning to enforce on the people who are employed is greater demands for productivity. If you're going to keep this job, you've got to do more. And that's beginning to show up in the data that even as the number of people employed is dropping slightly, the total output is continuing to go up. And that means simply the productivity of individual workers is increasing. If we look at dual career couples, that is also increasing. That's a result of the baby boomer market and the rich economic arena that created. It was projected by some sources back in the 90s that the number of women in the workforce would reach 75%, would be achieved by 2000. By the year 2000, I don't think we've yet reached that point. I think the number of women in the workforce has dropped proportionally, has dropped slightly. But it is still a definite factor in the overall economic employment situation these days. If you look at technology, it continues to alter the workplace. Nowadays, I spend almost a third of my time just answering emails. Now, that's unusual among my colleagues simply because I have such a much larger number of students in most semesters since I teach the introductory course. But it is clear that you and I are much more tied to computers now than we used to be. Many jobs are built around computers, and the computers themselves have begun to blur the distinction between home and work. My ex-wife works for one of the airlines, and she was, well, there are a couple of different stories related to careers that revolve around her. She was interviewed one time many years ago when the airline was was in a hiring mode, and I encouraged her to go down and have an interview, and she ran into some biddy of a white-wigged southern old lady who was the interviewing officer, and she never got past the first interview. She was simply, she was excused from the employment process on the very first interview. Very discouraging. She was annoyed. I was pissed. Wrong word. I was annoyed. But in any case, the next time the airline was hiring about 3 years later, I encouraged her to go again because I knew she was good at certain kinds of things particularly, and it seemed like that job would be important. And this time she passed the interview and was in fact put into sales. That particular airline tends to put people into the telephone lines. That is, when you call in, you may be talking to somebody in Denver. This airline has a main office here in Houston, and so forth. But you never know quite where the person's going to be. But they are a vital element of the airport, of the airline. They link you to the plane that you're going to ultimately get on. She turns out to be blazingly good in sales. And the sales force of the airline she joined at that time was in excess of 20,000. She was in the top 10 in terms of sales agents a year after she'd been employed. So basically what the airline missed by that screwed up interview was 3 years of a very productive person in sales. And she's so good at it that she is still in it. She enjoys it, first of all, and she's spectacularly good at interacting with people. And she's still in that job, and she's further up in terms of supervisory skills. The other point of the story was that she no longer works. She doesn't any longer go to the call center here in Houston. She works from home. For 8 hours a day or whatever her work time is, her telephone is, if I can't get to her, if I'm trying to call her during that period of time, because the phone is blocked in such a way that all it will take is calls from Continental Airlines. Oops, I said it. From that airline. And that is when those calls come into the general switchboard, they're sent out to whoever the agents are, and those agents now are literally spread out all over the country. It cuts down on commute time. It increases worker efficiency because they're closer to any problem that develops at home and so forth. A lot of different things, and those are directly a function of what computers have done for us. I mean, that job in sales is mainly a matter of connecting people to what airline, what flight they want to be on. And that's but one example of the ways in which computers are impacting our life and the world of work. So what's the best strategy for initiating and developing a career? David Campbell, back in 1974, really said it as well as I've ever been able to find somebody expressing it. What he said is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll probably end up somewhere else in terms of career development. And I would really add only one thought to that, and that is, even if you do have a plan, you're still likely to end up somewhere else. Planning a career after the fact is very easy. Earlier, I cited for you the progression of things that happened in my own career. When I left South Carolina for APA for a year's leave of absence, I had no idea that a year later I'd be moving to Houston. Okay, forward planning is a lot harder than looking back and saying, well, this is the events that caused my career to unfold. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. Let me show you one example of a major effect that career development does need to deal with, and the source of this is genuinely surprising, and that is the role of what are called chance encounters. Albert Bandura, whom you will recognize as the father, the progenitor of all of observational learning, one of the most basic forms of learning that we now talk about, was originally developed out of work by Albert Bandura. He published a paper in 1982 that focused on career development in general. I mean, you could extract from that what he was talking about. And let me just read to you one quote from that article in a 1982 American Psychologist. It starts on, I think, 747 in maybe the July issue, I think, if you're interested in tracking it down. It's a fascinating article. But in any case, what he said in there was, chance encounters play a prominent role in shaping the course of human lives. Keep in mind now, this is one of the preeminent experimental psychologists who's writing here, and yet he's crediting the role of chance. In a chance encounter, the separate chains of events that have their own causal determinants, but their intersection occurs fortuitously rather than through deliberate plan. He's essentially simply documenting what he means by chance encounters. Psychology cannot predict chance encounters, though you will notice that since Bandura's comments, there's a whole discipline and theory of the study of noise that has developed. Noise is essentially unpredictable or random events, and there's a whole discipline built around the effect of those random events. If you look at the effect of chance events in anyone's life, some of them have very minor or no effect at all. That can happen. Some of them have more lasting effects that can occur, and others will actually cause us to change the course of our life's path. What psychology can do is not study chance itself, excuse me, But it can study and predict the effects that such chance encounters will have. So even though we have to acknowledge the encounters themselves are caused by chance, we can still study what the impact of them is, ultimately. How do we predict their effects? Well, there are a lot of different things that we can look at to make those kind of predictions. One of them has to do with, essentially, personal determinants, features of you that we can use to predict what will be the effect of chance events. One of the things that you and I do in fact control directly, and yet that will monitor or interact, as you'll see here, interact with the role of chance events, is the entry skills that we establish for ourselves. And in that case, the fact that you're in higher education is one example of the way in which you're altering your total package of entry skills. Whether you're majoring in psychology or business or engineering or anything, the education that you get here statistically will have a demonstrable multi-thousand-dollar increase effect on the career that you earn on average, the salary that you earn on average during the course of your life. College investment is one of the best that you can make in terms of its impact on total earning power for an individual. And yet the groups that you associate with in that entry process are rather interesting. Groups that demand very little to join can have major effects on what you do. And yet groups with significant skill demands, I'm thinking here of something like Psyc, which is the National Honor Society of Psychology, are likely to have less effect. Because essentially to qualify for that group, you've already reached such a narrow range of competence that the group itself as a group doesn't really have much effect on you. There's some other factors that are personal that you and I can control and will impact the effects of chance encounters on us. One of these is emotional ties. In any kind of chance encounter, who's employed in a given job situation when you're employed there. If you like another person, their impact is likely to be much greater on you. You will model them. If they're in the same job that you are, you will pick up any behaviors that they exhibit that you tend to like or admire. And therefore, the emotional ties that you form with someone else, whether the same or opposite sex, typically in the same level in a company, will have major impacts on the ways in which things like that chance encounter, who was there when you were there, have on your overall value, improving personal determinants. We can also look at the role that values and your personal standards may have. Things like accidental encounters are likely to be more powerful if you share values and standards with the person with whom you have that accidental encounter, to the extent that you overlap with them in terms of your values, your standards, and so forth, your beliefs, your fundamental way of doing business. It's likely to have a greater impact on you. As I look back through my whole career, I would essentially assess that I have moved toward an increasingly research-strong institution during the course of my life. But I think one of the things that set that was the department chair, who was the very first man that I ever worked for. To the extent in an academic environment you can really refer to a department chair as a boss, because that's really not the proper word in the academic environment. He is certainly the leader and ultimately responsible for the budget of a department, and in some ways related to the kind of raise you get. But I would still argue that one of those people who had the greatest impact on my career was the original department chair that I worked for at the University of South Carolina in my first job, and he wasn't even department chair through the full time. But he and I somehow clicked. I understood what he was after academically. I happened to fully agree with him, strongly agree with him. And he, as a result, had a very positive impact on me. And in turn, through him, I met the president of the University of South Carolina. Interestingly enough, his name was Tom Jones. But he turned out to be an extraordinarily powerful academic. He had a lot of contacts nationally, and he was a very good resource for me. And it was purely by accident that meeting occurred, but it was directly as a result of the action of that first department chair for whom I ever worked. So that's the kind of place where the emotional ties and the values and personal standards that you have can in some ways significantly alter your career. Now let's look at another general class of events that can also impact us, and that is the social determinants that go into a given situation. This would include things like, for instance, the rewards that are offered by the by the group. For instance, university professors are usually evaluated primarily by their publications, and therefore that's what they tend to emphasize. Undergraduates sometimes get a little annoyed because so-and-so isn't in his or her office. Well, they're doing research at the moment, and so forth. Well, the problem is that although we are charged with teaching, research, and service as the big three in an academic career, the fact is that the main thing that's evaluated for you is your professional research output. And therefore that's why many people simply follow naturally into paying most attention to the research that they're doing. And that's an impact, a social impact that the group, the academic environment, has on incoming members. Another thing that is also important, and this is a mouthful of words, and I'll try to explain what I'm talking about here, but it's the symbolic environment and the management of information. That is ultimately a social effect, but it does have a major impact on your reaction to chance encounters. The information explosion is what I'm referring to here, and it's vastly increased the importance of both print and communication media in forming and maintaining opinions. Okay? Modern day politicians may have a communication director before they have anybody else in their effort, simply because they want to get into the media and be heard. That's by far the most important way, most effective way in which politicians seeking election can impact the people that are going to be voting on them, is to be seen in their living room, listened to in their living room. You notice, in fact, we're using television. This was rare. I started doing television tapes back in, I'd have to think exactly, but it was right around 1973 or 4. So the option has been around for 30 or 35 years, but its use has really been nationalized now, because you'll notice that our tapes are on YouTube, and a YouTube can be reached from any computer. And therefore you can do it at home. So the effect of putting the TV broadcasts from television onto the YouTube has been to greatly increase the potential audience to which we can appeal. And that's one example of the symbolic environment, or the environment of symbols that I'm talking about. We are in an information-rich environment, and controlling that channel is very important as a social determinant of your own success in a given situation. Now let me rearrange these words because there are too many on the screen, but I've got a couple of more determinants that I want to rearrange for you. All the information is still there. It's kind of a bizarre shift that I did there. But there are at least two more factors that I want to mention. One has to do with the closeness of the surrounding milieu. Love that word. The social environment in which you're operating in any given situation. A casual group has really very few intense followers, okay? By contrast, a group like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, has a very specific series of demands that are directly part of the organization of the group itself, and the members are expected to be able to repeat those demands verbally, verbatim, run down the list of the 12 things that you're working toward and striving to achieve. And there's a great deal of group support for someone who stumbles in that situation. That is, they will come back and remind them, let's go through the steps and see where you are and where you screwed up and how and so forth. But that's a case where the surrounding milieu that an alcoholic invests himself in, if he's really dedicated to correcting the drinking problem, what he's falling subject to is the fact that in general, the more closed the group, the tighter the bonding of individual members to that group will be. Many different examples I could point out to you. A sorority or fraternity has a set of standards that it applies, and it filters pretty heavily the people that come into the receptions, the parties and everything when they're soliciting new members. But there's a very tight analysis that goes on about, will this person fit in with the social group that we've got? And the bonding then that you get when you are a member of a sorority or fraternity is strong as a result of that selection process that's involved. In addition, the other thing that I'd talk about, and I have trouble pronouncing this word, but it's psychological closedness is what I'm talking about there. You might just say closedness. I'm not quite sure why they put the D in there. But in any case, what that's dealing with is the belief structures in our lives. They basically give us means by which we can interpret and predict various kinds of daily events that we do or do not want to participate in. The stronger the belief system that is instilled by any particular group, the greater the impact that group will have on individuals that it does welcome into its fold. The rules by which a sorority or fraternity operates are important in governing what the believers, the members, will participate in. Okay, so now let's look at it from a slightly different direction, and that is, why do people work? There are a wide variety of different theories about this. I could spend 2 days just talking about naming the theories that are involved in this particular area. So we're just going to sample a limited number of them, and I'll show you some ways in which they kind of reach out and try to describe how you and I operate in a work environment. One of the most basic of these was proposed by Dici way back in the mid-1970s, and that was what's called trait theory. It was from this theory that he developed his proposal for what he called intrinsic motivation. In looking at the work environment and saying that some people are intrinsically motivated, what he's essentially talking about is the underlying principle here that people do well because they look to themselves for a mental reward for any job done well. Okay? I was thinking about that as I was driving home last night, having spent 15 hours here trying to pull together today's lecture, and I came away with the idea that the coverage here is pretty good. I did an amazing array of looking to try and find the sources that I wanted to talk about here today. But that was an intrinsic award. I mean, you wouldn't even been aware that I had given it to myself, except for the fact that I even mentioned it. But that's the kind of thing that really is dealing with intrinsic motivation, the internal drive and the ability to reinforce yourself if you do a good job, or to acknowledge if you've done a bad job, but to have motivations that keep you working in a given environment. That's an intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, in direct contrast to that, Dici also talks about, his name is D-E-C-I, by the way, Dici, also identified what is called extrinsic motivation. This is where people do well because they look to the environment for tangible reinforcers. Such people work when the incentive is there, otherwise not. That theory has a problem. And that is that this is like having a dependent variable and an intervening variable, but no independent variable. She works well because she's intrinsically motivated. Doesn't say much. You really have to go back and anchor what you mean by the intervening variable there. Okay, what does intrinsically motivated mean? Only works, only operates effectively, only identifies anything significant when you can tie it back to the factors that lead to the production of intrinsic motivation, particularly if you're going to then use that as the reason why we have behavior resulting from it. Substantiating data for extrinsic motivation has been hard to find. In turn, that leads to another article which in some ways is related to what I'm talking about, and that is what's called trait-situation interaction. Okay? This is from the work of Walter Mischel, who wrote a book that has become a classic called Personality and Assessment. What he did in that book through the course of it was to basically criticize what is called the trait view, the idea that you and I have within us a limited fundamental number of traits or behavioral characteristics. He also faulted psychoanalytic analyses, which are basically founded on the same kind of approach. That is, that there are a limited number of features of you and I that govern how we interact in a given situation. What those theories do is to stress the internal structure of personality itself, and it's viewed as they're viewed, the features that we talk about are viewed as kind of broad internal phenomena and traits that are essentially constant in differing situation and across time. Mischel takes a strong position against that. What he argued after reviewing the data was to point out that such traits do a poor job of predicting behavior across a wide variety of situations. Take as an example, another author that I was reading was suggesting that consider if you're aggressive, you may do so with your significant other in a given interaction simply to protect your own interests. You know, there's something that you want to do on a given Saturday night or something like that. You're overtly aggressive when the discussion boils down to what are we going to do? And you're very aggressive in representing your opinion and why we ought to do that and so forth and so on. And yet if you've just been hired by a new employer, you'll be Mr. or Ms. Wimpy with the new boss. That is, you're very much going to follow his or her lead in that kind of a work situation, and yet in both cases we call you aggressive? That's kind of the thing that Mischel was arguing against. That is, that it's not purely the traits or the psychoanalytic factors that dictate what we do, how we behave. What Mischel was essentially arguing in favor of was a position called situationism, situation with an ISM added to it. And that is essentially, what he's arguing essentially is that a person's personality can vary substantially from one situation to another. And he now believes, as do many others, the situationalists, that both the person and the situation will determine what behavior is manifested in a particular situation. So what you've got essentially is that the trait, as we were originally talking about it, that is the person, and the situation, the environment, both of those variables have to be assessed to really understand and predict what's going to happen in a particular situation. That is, consistency of behavior depends on the kind of persons, the people who are involved, the situations in which they find themselves, and the behaviors that you're sampling in those situations. And so then if we look at, let me go back in my notes here just a second because I stuck that in the middle of something else I was talking about, and I want to make sure I pick up everything I meant to say here. Yeah, that'll work. Well, let me not get out of sync here. Yeah, I have. Out of a second here, I'll eventually get straightened out here, screwed up just before the end of the lecture. Really smart. One of the examples of traits and the interactions in which they may occur is essentially the idea of the entrepreneur whose efforts, when they're successful, are rewarded by profit. Theoretically, what's being offered there is the idea that more work leads to more profit. And then you factor back in the idea of what traits are involved versus the situation. Is he in a competitive environment or not, and so forth. The problems with that are that essentially in any organization, what is a reward for one person may be a hindrance for another. I'm thinking, for instance, about the fact that a trip for an administrator in a business may be a rich reward because it gets that person out into the broader economic environment. But on the other hand, for a researcher in that same organization, a trip might be viewed as an active impediment to what he or she has been hired to do. So that's where you've got the interaction between the individual drives the trait of the individual as opposed to the situation in which he or she is working. And this in turn will lead into a discussion then of theory X and theory Y. The behavioral theories is what I was essentially describing there a minute ago, dealing with the issues related to habit, drive, and so forth and so on. Theory X, theory Y is where we'll pick it up next time, because what it has to do with is different theories about the traits within individuals and what those effects are in given situations. So we'll pick it up, theory X, theory Y, and the more recently developed theory Z at the beginning of the next lecture.